Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We've got another week here, another George R. R. Martin short story, and another response for Preston Jacobs. Men of Greywater Station. So let's jump into this here in chronological order. First comment is about the shooting star, and of course, Preston already talked about this quite a bit, and I think fairly thoroughly. But one thing that was not mentioned, which I thought of, was the great sword Dawn, which is the ancestral sword of House Dane. It's said to be made from the heart of a fallen star, and given what we see here, the shooting star is actually a spaceship. This sort of made me think, well, maybe there's an analogy to be made there as well. Obviously, this could just refer to a regular meteorite, which fell, and then they made it from the meteorite. But generally, meteors are made out of basic elements like iron or nickel or what have you. So and the description of Dawn is pretty clearly that it is an unusual metal. It's not like any of the typical metals like they work with in this world. So it made me think, most of our, or a lot of our, most advanced metallurgy is applied to spacecraft components today, like space shuttles and the International Space Station and so forth. So couldn't it be that Dawn was made out of, in fact, a fallen piece of a spaceship or a satellite or what have you? And it, melted on the way down, and they were left with this, raw, advanced, metal that they used to make a sword. Just a thought. And I'm guessing I'm not the first one to think of this. If any of you guys have any thoughts on this specifically, then leave me a comment and let's talk about it. Next one I've got here, and this one's a little more abstract. I call it the why. And it's basically the question of the motivations of the players at stake. It's kind of more prevalent. I saw more people discuss this in the previous story, The Hero, where on the one hand, the hero's in combat, he's part of a war, obviously, but we don't really ask why he's fighting those people. We sort of assume that it's for reasons, and we make assumptions. On the other hand, when the hero's killed, there was a lot of discussion that I saw in the comments of that video as to why he was killed. And of course, George R. R. Martin leaves it very ambiguous. We aren't given a specific reason why he was killed, so there's a lot of conjecture there. My conclusion is that the why in that case really wasn't important. It could have been for any number of reasons. So the why really wasn't important. So long as you can find a way to justify that your target is part of the them instead of part of us, you can do whatever you want to them. So the why is basically irrelevant. So now in this story, the men of Greywater Station, we're never given a reason why. They're trying to find a way to commit genocide on the, I think we're calling them the Findi. We don't know why. And the story doesn't really discuss it. And the protagonists in the story don't discuss it among themselves. And honestly, I haven't really seen it discussed in the comments here in our book club as well either. We simply assume it's for reasons. And of course, because, like I mentioned before, they're the protagonists, we assume they're doing what they're doing, and, we kind of have their backs on that. But at the same time, I haven't really seen an examination either of why the fungus is trying to kill the men of Greywater Station. And perhaps I should qualify that a little bit, because personally, I'm not 100% sure that we've ever really seen the fungus try to kill the men of Greywater Station. So far, I think we have evidence that the fungus is taking them over, but I don't know if we've ever really seen anybody die. And I sort of went through and reread this and tried to track down, make sure that I'm correct on this. And there's a few examples where maybe you could have some arguments. So there was the fungus man that throws a rock. So maybe you could say, well, that's a sign of aggression. There's the swamp bat. During the middle of the combat, there's a swamp bat who climbs into the engine of the flyer, and then the flyer blows up, so maybe you could say that's an act of aggression. And probably the most clear one is a little bit later, they call it a slinker, who bites Del Vecchio's leg, and then he starts limping along after that. And that's probably the most clear sign. But, aside from these few exceptions, really we're seeing the fungus creatures attacking the station, right? They're attacking the technology, but it's really the humans that are killing each other. And I would say that for being scientists, or supposedly being scientists, the protagonists have really failed to examine a number of alternative hypotheses for the fungus, such as maybe the creatures or the humans that are taken over by the fungus aren't being mind controlled at all, but instead, they've reached a new awareness and they've adopted the collective of the fungus voluntarily, and they're working on behalf of the fungus out of their own free will. Maybe they believe they're doing the right thing, and or maybe they know something that the uninfected humans do not. So there's a lot that's left open, much like the previous story. There's a lot that's left open of the overall motivations of the players involved. And I'd be interested in seeing some more discussion on that as well. If any of you guys have any thoughts, share those in the comments as well, and let's talk about them. Next one here, Vietnam War. And Preston spent a lot of time in the previous story as well talking about the Vietnam War and George R. R. Martin's aims in all this, and the influence the Vietnam War had on him apparently during his formative years. But we don't really have as much discussion on the Vietnam War for the men of Greywater Station, which personally I think is maybe a bit of an oversight, because to me this story smacked a lot more of the Vietnam War than actually the previous one did. And let's discuss, for example, the military philosophy involved here. The men of Greywater Station adopt an attrition-based style of warfare, which basically means they're trying to kill the enemy, who they perceive as the enemy. They're trying to kill as many of them as quickly as possible. That's attrition, okay? And it's the logic of essentially all the conventional armies in the world, and that's what they're designed around. And obviously everyone has a different approach to this, but essentially that's the overall goal, is to attrit the enemy. And in military history, especially in modern military history, this has tended to be a very Western style of warfare as well. This is essentially what von Clausewitz wrote about in his work. And actually, another example would be chess. Chess is basically a simulation of attrition style warfare, where you're trying to take each other's pieces as quickly as possible to reach your overall objective. And in the Vietnam War, this is essentially what Westmoreland used for the United States and their South Vietnamese allies, which bring overwhelming firepower, overwhelming manpower to bear on the enemy and kill them as quickly as possible. Now, the fungus does not use conventional warfare. The focus of the fungus is not on attrition. The focus of the fungus is convincing the humans to fight each other. And this is what we would call unconventional warfare, or another term that gets bandied about quite a bit is asymmetric warfare, which I think is somewhat redundant because, to my knowledge, in the history of all warfare, there's never been generals that have set out and said, okay, well, we're going to make sure we fight with exactly the same advantages and exactly the same disadvantages as our enemy, and on exactly the same territory, and we're going to make it as even as possible. Nobody's ever done that. Of course, you're going to play to your strengths and try to maximize your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. And so I think asymmetric warfare is a little bit redundant. But anyways, I'm digressing. What we're discussing now, the unconventional style, is a much more Eastern style of warfare. This is essentially what Sun Tzu wrote about in The Art of War, Sun Tzu being the ancient Chinese military philosopher. And he's a big proponent of this. And I've looked up a few quotes. If you haven't read his book, The Art of War, it's very good. But I picked out a few quotes here, and I'll read them for you and see if anything about these quotes remind you of what the fungus is doing. Okay? First one, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Okay? If you are far from the enemy, make him believe you are near. Pretend inferiority and encourage his arrogance. Be extremely subtle even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate. And finally, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And this is essentially the same strategy that General Giap employed against the United States during the Vietnam War. He didn't try to attrit the U.S. forces. He basically came at the war with the goal of convincing the American public to fight against the American military. Right? They're pitting the Americans against themselves, and ultimately he was successful in doing that, much like the fungus is successful in convincing the human parties involved to fight each other. And I think following up on this point, I think we may be able to forgive the men of Greywater Station for their oversights in this because, frankly, they're amateurs, right? None of them have any professional military training. This stuff that I'm quoting you right now is just the very, very basics. I mean, I think Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz are, I mean, that's like required reading for enlisted men. I mean, that's not even officer stuff. They're learning way more complicated strategic stuff than this. So we may be able to assume that if there were, military professionals involved at Greywater Station instead of scientists, maybe this would have been a lot more obvious to them. There would have been fail-safes in place, and the situation would have panned out differently. So maybe we can forgive the protagonist for making these bad decisions. And another thought I had, sort of related to this, is maybe the fungus. Maybe this isn't inherently the way the fungus operates. Maybe the fungus chose this unconventional route because it had no other choice. For example, the men of Greywater Station, they're scientists. They're in a research station. It's not even like a professional military installation. They're in a research station. And to this point, the fungus still hasn't been able to overwhelm them, right? They've been able to fend it off. Apparently there's been some conflict, but the men of Greywater Station have been okay. So now that a whole shipload of professionally trained military men has landed on this planet, what chance does the fungus have of overwhelming them when it can't even overwhelm Greywater Station, right? So maybe it was forced into this position where it had to think unconventionally and operate unconventionally in order to get the resolution that it wanted. Just another thing to think about. So that's a lot about Greywater Station. What does that have to do with A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, who else does George R. R. Martin write about who's a military amateur? To me, that character is Dany. And she very frequently ignores the advice of the experienced military men around her, which is kind of ironic because she's fine, taking them as lovers or having them as bodyguards or champions or whatnot. But very frequently, when it comes down to military types of decisions, she kind of comes up with these resolutions on her own. And I don't know if she necessarily enjoys the type of success that she would like or what we would like for her as readers of the story. And in following up on this analogy, who else do we know of that fights an unconventional style of warfare? I would say that's a good example of the Sons of the Harpy, right? Who Dany has been unsuccessful against, at least so far as we know. So it also doesn't help that Dany has also lost. I mean, there was at one point in time an extremely experienced military commander who she did trust, which was Drogo. But now he's dead. So this puts her in a very vulnerable position and makes her very easy to manipulate. If you were somebody that's trying to operate behind the scenes and manipulate Dany, I think this definitely plays in your favor. And then also, wrapping up this point, this is my final thought here on this. In Preston's review of Men of Greywater Station, he used a lot of imagery of the others. Which, when analyzing the story of ice that's transpiring in the north, it was a little interesting to me since if we're thinking of unconventional warfare in what's transpiring in the north, I don't really think so much of the others. The others, at least so far as we've seen them operate, have been operating much more like a conventional force than an unconventional force. If anything, the unconventional operators in the north are the children. So just keep that in mind. Just another thought. I don't know if that's going to be earth-shattering or anything like that, but just keep that in mind as we're reading through the book club. I'm guessing this is going to come up again. I don't think this is the last time we're going to see this, but also as we're reading A Song of Ice and Fire, see how that plays out as well. Here's my final point. Us versus them. This was the thing I talked about the most in my first video, the first response. And I just wanted to touch on it again here quickly as well. And Preston referenced this in his video, so I don't want to rehash the stuff that he said, but just a couple of examples here. The us versus them. Let's talk about a couple specifics. There's the troops on the transport, right? The story opens with this. And it's kind of shocking how quickly the men of Greywater Station move the troops on the transport, even though they're humans. They move these troops on the transports from the us to the them category almost before the ship even lands. They're already talking about what they're going to do about these people. So it's pretty surprising how quickly that happens. And then the other one, I'll call him Rain. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce his name, but Rain gets moved from the us to the them category basically as soon as he leaves the station. He becomes a them, and they don't really consider him anymore. So it happens pretty quickly, but it also happens pretty believably. If you're reading the story, the logic of the characters as they're presenting it, it sort of makes sense. It's like, well, they're sort of screwed now, so we're not going to worry about them anymore. But if you're looking at it from a species point of view, it's actually pretty surprising. The transition happens pretty fast. In some environments, I want to throw this out there for context. In some environments, the us versus them mentality is useful. If you look at the history of human beings as a species, for the vast majority of our existence, we've been primitive Stone Age humans. And in that kind of an environment, you have the individual and then you have the tribe. And the tribe is very useful for the benefit of the individual because you're living this tenuous subsistence lifestyle, and the mentality is needed for survival. And it enhances the species. The strongest tribes, the ones with the strongest unity and the people that are working the hardest for the tribe, making the best decisions, those are the ones that survives. And the weakest tribes sort of get weeded out. They don't contribute to the gene pool. And then as a whole, if you're looking at the species as a whole, the species improves, even though, of course, obviously the story is not so great for the weaker tribes that don't survive. However, if you're taking this same tribalistic mentality and you're applying it to a science fiction environment where there is dramatically different technology at play, and coupled with that, when you're weaponizing this technology, the force multipliers at play are extremely more deadly, many orders of magnitude more deadly than saying just a caveman with a spear. The tribalistic mentality, the benefits of it start to break down. If you lose a person from your tribe in a Stone Age environment, you have one less hunter to help you, let's say. But other than that, there's not really that much detriment. Whereas if you lose one person, say Rain in the Men of Greywater Station, you lose one person, the ramifications of that because of the technology in play can be extreme. If you're looking at it purely from a human point of view, because Rain left, essentially they lost all of their research. They lost their ability to commit genocide on the Fendi and maybe save the human race. We don't know what stakes were at play ultimately. But what I'm trying to say is that overall, as the technology increases, the risks involved with maintaining that tribal mentality are dramatically increased. So keep that in mind as well as we're reading the stories. And if you have any more additional thoughts on it, definitely leave them in the comments. And also, guys, if any of you have more comprehensive thoughts, I'd love to see more response videos. I mean, this is a book club, and we're supposed to be communicating with each other and sharing ideas. So definitely make some more responses, and I'll look for any thoughts you guys have. All right, thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.